I had just finished tying the last cinnamon ribbon around the folded napkins when the phone buzzed. Some silences you can feel coming, like a storm in your bones. 43 Thanksgivings I'd prepared in this house, each one a testament to something I thought was unbreakable. The turkey was perfect, the pies cooling, the good china gleaming under soft light. 4 o'clock came and went, then 5. The candles burned lower as the shadows grew longer across an empty table set for 5. I sat alone in that silence, napkin across my lap, listening to the clock tick in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. There's a difference between lonely and forgotten. That night, I learned which one hurts worse. What I didn't know then was that the betrayal simmering in that perfect, untouched meal would change everything, not just my address, but the very foundation of who I thought we were. They say family is forever. They never tell you what happens when forever breaks. I had just finished tying the last cinnamon ribbon around the folded napkins when the phone buzzed. It was Michael. His voice came through quick, almost distracted. Mom, same plan as always. We'll be there at 4. Don't go overboard. Okay. I told him I wouldn't. Of course I said that. But in my head, I'd already soaked the cranberries, peeled the sweet potatoes, and laid out the turkey rub from my late husband's old recipe card, the one Michael used to sneak taste from when he was little. This year, Thanksgiving fell quiet. No snow yet, but the Vermont air was sharp with that pre-winter stillness. I had lit the fireplace early, put on Frank Sinatra in the background, baked 2 pies, 1 apple, 1 pecan just in case the kids brought someone new. I always made extra. By 3 o'clock, everything was ready. The tablecloth was ironed. The good plates, those cream-colored ones with the gold edges, were set just like my mother used to do. I even took out the little ceramic turkey salt shaker I hadn't touched in years. You know, when you've cooked Thanksgiving for 43 years, you don't think about recipes anymore. You think in memories, the sound of William carving the turkey, the way Michael's eyes would light up at the first sight of stuffing, the time little Sophie spilled cranberry sauce all over her new dress and cried until I showed her how the stain made a perfect heart shape. I thought this one would be the last Thanksgiving in this old house before I downsized next spring. That's what made it feel more special, more permanent. The maple floors had seen 4 decades of our footsteps. The kitchen walls had absorbed the steam of countless holiday meals. William and I had brought Michael home to this house when he was just 2 days old. It wasn't just lumber and nails. It was the physical form of our family history. I glanced at the time, 3:17. Mashed potatoes went into the warmer. Gravy stirred smooth. I wiped the edge of every plate again, just to be sure. Then I sat down, just for a minute. I looked at the old clock on the wall, the one Michael made in shop class when he was 14. It ticked soft and steady. The front porch stayed quiet, and for a split second, something in me stirred, like a whisper I couldn't hear yet, a feeling I didn't have words for. Maybe some of you know that kind of silence. Not peaceful, not empty, just waiting too long. Anyway, I stood back up, smoothed my sweater, and checked my phone again. Still nothing. If you've ever had a moment like that, when the turkey's done, the pies are perfect, and all you hear is the ticking of a clock, then you already know where this story is going. But I promise you, you don't know how it ends. So sit with me a little while, because what came after that silence changed everything. At 3:46, my phone lit up again. Not a call, just a short text from Rebecca, running behind. Last minute change, going to my parents' place instead. Hope that's okay? There was no punctuation, no heart emoji, no see you soon. I stared at it for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen. I waited, thinking maybe Michael would follow up with something clearer, but he didn't. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen and stirred the gravy again. I lowered the heat like that would keep something warm, though nothing felt warm at all. The oven light still glowed over the rolls. I opened it and stared inside, like maybe they'd speak for me. They didn't. At 4 o'clock, I stood at the front window and looked out toward the street. A few cars rolled by. None of them slowed. One neighbor carried a pie across the lawn. Another waved from her porch. I nodded back but didn't smile. By 4:17, the quiet was louder. I moved the cranberry chutney to the fridge, took the foil off the turkey, and carved a few slices just enough to keep myself from losing the ritual. Then I set one plate, just one, sat down at the head of the table, napkin across my lap, fork in hand. I didn't eat. I listened. The house had that kind of silence that only comes when the clock keeps ticking, but nothing else moves. The radio had shut off an hour ago. The ice in the pitcher had melted. The candle I lit for the centerpiece flickered like it wasn't sure why it was still burning. Outside, the light was slipping away, not quite sunset, but enough to press a shadow across the living room carpet, the kind that made everything feel farther apart. For a while, I sat like that, Not out of sadness, not even anger, yet just something else. A strange, suspended stillness, like standing in a room that no longer belonged to me. I pulled my phone closer and reread the message. Still nothing from Michael, no apology, no promise to stop by later, just that one flat line from Rebecca. It was then I remembered last Christmas. Michael told me to give him full access to the shared bank card, said it would make holiday shopping easier. I agreed. Of course I did, because back then, I still thought love meant yes. Now the gravy was cold, the table untouched, and my hands were shaking just slightly as I picked up the plate, carried it back to the counter, and placed the cover back on top. Not because I was done waiting, but because I finally understood that no one was coming. I left the dining table exactly as it was, full plates, unpoured wine, napkins still folded with a cinnamon ribbon. There was something about seeing it untouched that made the truth settle deeper. It wasn't about being late. It was about not being thought of at all. I walked back to the living room, turned off the fireplace. The warmth that had wrapped the house all afternoon was fading anyway. I stood there for a while, hands at my sides, staring at the coat Michael left behind last winter, still hanging on the rack, still waiting for an owner who didn't remember where he put it. There's a difference between lonely and forgotten. That night, I learned which one hurt worse. I didn't eat dinner. I didn't touch the pies. I sat in my reading chair with a blanket across my knees and the hallway light on, just in case someone changed their mind. At some point, I think I fell asleep sitting up. When I woke, it was after 10, and the silence had thickened into something heavier than I could name. I went to the kitchen, packed everything up slowly. Turkey slices into plastic containers, stuffing sealed tight. The cranberry was still bright red, untouched. I put it all away like I was tucking in a child no one had come to claim. Then I opened the pantry and pulled out the old photo box. I hadn't touched it in months, maybe years. I sat at the counter and sifted through the snapshots. Michael at 8 with gravy on his nose, his high school graduation, the photo I kept framed on the mantel for a decade. The last one was from 2 years ago, all of us at Thanksgiving. Rebecca laughing with a glass of wine, Michael reaching for seconds. I remembered thinking then how full my house sounded, how the walls actually echoed with laughter. That was the year Rebecca asked if I'd ever considered selling. Downsizing, she called it. Said it'd be easier on me. Said the kids could help manage things if I made Michael co-owner on a few accounts. I had agreed. Back then, I still thought shared meant safe. I put the photos back in the box and wiped the counter clean. The house didn't echo anymore. Not with laughter. Not with anything. Before heading to bed, I turned off the outside lights. The street was empty, just the porch light of the Hendersons down the road still glowing, catching snowflakes in the beam. Inside, I stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up like maybe they'd feel less steep with someone beside me, but there was no one. I climbed them slowly, gripping the rail with one hand and holding the photo box in the other. That night, I placed the box on my bedside table and laid down without changing clothes. The pillow was cold, the blankets too still, and for the first time in years, I locked my bedroom door, not because I feared anyone breaking in, but because something had already left. The next morning, I woke early, not because I had plans. My body just couldn't stay asleep anymore. There's something about a heavy silence that carries over into the morning, sitting on your chest before your feet even touch the floor. I went downstairs and made coffee. The smell filled the kitchen like it always did, but the air felt thinner. I didn't turn on the radio this time. I needed the quiet, or maybe I just couldn't stand the sound of pretend joy. As I sipped, I remembered I still hadn't paid the gas bill. The envelope had been sitting on the counter near the fridge for 3 days. I opened my laptop, logged into the bank account, and froze. There it was, a charge I didn't recognize, $11.38 from a travel agency. Not local, Florida-based. The timestamp showed the payment cleared 3 days ago. I blinked. It was from the secondary account, the one Michael convinced me to open last year while I said it was better for online purchases, less risk. I had left him as a cosigner. Never thought twice about it, but the transaction didn't stop there. Below it were others: airport parking, luggage services, spa reservations, all in his name. I didn't shake. I didn't gasp. I just sat there, rereading the numbers over and over, like maybe if I stared long enough, they'd shift into something logical. But they never did. I opened my email and searched for any confirmation from the bank. Nothing. He hadn't forwarded anything to me. I clicked through the calendar. Thanksgiving week, right when he said they were staying home. Right when Rebecca texted me they had a change of plans. Then it all lined up. The silence, the vague excuses, the sudden detour to her parents' place, the missing dinner. They hadn't been across town. They hadn't been stuck in traffic. They were gone, on a trip, using money that wasn't theirs to begin with. I stood up slowly, walked over to the photo of us from Michael's college graduation. He was holding his diploma. I was standing beside him, arms linked, proud as any mother would be. I took the frame off the shelf and turned it down on the side table. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. What I felt wasn't rage. It was something worse, a sort of emptiness wrapped in clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, it just settles in and stays. I sat back down and wrote the amount on a yellow notepad. $11, you're $38. I circled it. Then underneath, I wrote 3 more lines. Cruz lies me, and I underlined the last one, because no matter how many people were involved in this, the only one who had let it happen was sitting in that kitchen with a pen in her hand. And her name was Martha. I didn't leave the house that day. I didn't answer texts, not that there were many. A few automated holiday sales. A reminder from the pharmacy. Nothing from Michael. Nothing from Rebecca. Around 3 in the afternoon, I sat down with the old tablet Michael bought me years ago. I hadn't used it in a while, but I remembered he had helped me install a few apps, including one for our shared phone account. Back then, he said it was to monitor family usage, keep things tidy. The app still worked. I tapped through, looked at the shared data log. There it was, a string of locations and pings. Port Canaveral, Miami, a tagged Wi-Fi network labeled Suncrest Cruise Guest. I clicked on one of the pings. It showed a timestamp Wednesday night, Thanksgiving Eve. While I was stuffing the turkey, they were boarding. The photos came later. I didn't go looking for them. They found me. Sophie, my granddaughter, had a public profile. I don't think she knew I could see it. There were pictures, sun hats, lounge chairs. Rebecca and her family sitting at a long table with a banner above that said Captain's Dinner. In the middle of the table was a bottle of red wine. I recognized it instantly. I had given it to Michael last Christmas. Vintage, unopened. I remembered the bow I tied around its neck. And there it was, opened, half gone, on a table I wasn't invited to, poured into glasses I didn't raise. Another photo showed Sophie holding a card, handwritten. It read, Happy Thanksgiving, with the word family underlined in gold ink. I didn't know where the breath in my chest went. Disappeared without warning, like someone opened a door in a pressurized room. I clicked back. There were more photos. A group shot. Michael smiling wide, Rebecca laughing. Her parents on either side, arms around the kids. I scanned the picture slowly. Not a single empty chair. Not a single glance that said someone was missing. No gesture, no mention. I closed the tablet, slid it across the table, and pressed my palms flat against the surface. The wood felt cold, smooth, like it had nothing left to give me. I stood and walked into the dining room again. Everything was still there, unchanged, just colder now. I took one of the plates off the table and set it in the sink, then another, one by one. The cranberry dish was the last to go. When I finished, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the empty backyard. The maple tree had lost its leaves. The garden beds were bare, nothing left to tend. In that moment, I realized something quiet but certain. They hadn't just skipped dinner. They had erased me from the table entirely. And somehow, they didn't even feel the need to explain. 3 days passed without a word, not a call, not a check-in, not even a stray message pretending to ask if I was doing all right. The cruise must have still been going, or maybe it was over, and they were just waiting until enough time passed to come up with something easy to say. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't go chasing one, either. Instead, I sat down with my papers, not the ones they thought I forgot about, the old ones, the original deeds, the account agreements, the folder with my name on it, the one I kept in the file drawer behind the pantry door, under the emergency candles. That afternoon, I pulled everything out and laid it across the dining table, the same table that had waited with full plates and empty chairs. It felt right to lay the truth out on that wood. One paper in particular caught my eye, a joint ownership form. I remember the day Michael brought it over. Said he'd read it all for me. Said it was just a backup in case anything happened to me. Said it was better that way. But the wording was more than backup. It was transfer, partial control, silent authority. I traced the signature with my finger, my own handwriting, still trusting, still blind. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the account portal. I dug deeper this time. A few more charges popped up, not just the cruise, hotel stays, delivery orders to addresses I didn't know, payments toward a timeshare inquiry. The pieces were no longer separate. They lined up now in a clear and ugly row. They hadn't just taken a trip. They were planning more. And I was footing the bill. I printed everything, laid it out, stacked it, labeled it. The more I organized it, the less it hurt. The pain turned into precision. I reached for the landline, not my cell. The landline I kept for moments that still needed weight. I called Susan. She was my friend from church, but more than that, she was the one who'd said to me once, half joking, that if anything ever felt off in the numbers, she had a cousin who worked in estate law. I wasn't joking now. She answered on the second ring. I didn't give much detail, just said I needed help reviewing a financial situation. She didn't ask questions. She just gave me a name and address and told me I was making the right call. That night, I went to the hallway closet and pulled out a small box. It held nothing fancy, just a copy of William's will, some saved letters, a recipe card written in my mother's hand. I added the printed pages to it, closed the lid, taped it shut. Then I turned off the porch light, not just for the night, but because the candle I kept burning for too long had finally gone out, and I had no intention of lighting it again. The Sunday after Thanksgiving, I heard tires crunch the gravel outside. I didn't move to the window. I didn't need to. I knew the sound of Michael's car. It parked at the same crooked angle it always had. A door slammed. Footsteps came up the walk. Then the knock, not rushed, not heavy, just firm enough to say he expected it to open. I didn't answer right away. I let the sound settle through the hallway, moved down to the kitchen, back to where I stood with my hands dry from washing the last of the untouched dishes. He knocked again. Then the door opened. He still had a key. Of course he did. I had never asked for it back. His voice called out just one word, Mom. I didn't speak. I sat down at the table, already dressed, already waiting, not for him, for myself. He walked in, wore the same jacket he had left last winter, carried nothing but his phone, looked tired but not worried. I watched his eyes sweep the kitchen. They paused at the empty counters, the clean sink. The folded linen stacked neatly on the chair beside me. We just got back, he said, meant to call. Things got away from us. I said nothing. Then he mentioned the bank, said there had been some holiday charges, and he hoped it hadn't caused confusion. Just a mix-up. Rebecca had booked things quickly. They'd pay it back. I slid the folder across the table. Nothing dramatic. Just paper and ink and truth. He glanced at the top page. His face changed. A flicker. Like he realized it was no longer about apology. It was about record. I've spoken with an advisor, I told him. The co-ownership has been revoked. Legal steps have already begun. The account is locked. The house title is being reevaluated. That's not necessary, he said. We're family, I said. Family doesn't forget the table they came from. He stood there, still trying to measure how much he could recover. I could see it behind his eyes. The weighing, the adjusting. He asked if I needed anything. I told him the spare key could stay on the hook by the door, but it wouldn't open anything that mattered anymore. He looked at the photo frame on the shelf, the one turned down. He didn't touch it. I stood up, not quickly, just certain. I told him I had errands to run, and I walked past him without pause, coat in hand, purse over my shoulder. He stayed in the kitchen, didn't follow, didn't call out. The door shut behind me with a soft click. Outside, the cold had come in sharper than before, but it didn't sting. Not the way silence had, not the way erasure had. I walked to the car with nothing shaking in my hands, and I didn't look back. I didn't hear from Michael the following week, but I did hear from the bank. A formal confirmation came in the mail. My request had gone through. The joint authority was officially revoked. The secondary account had been frozen pending review. The notary seal pressed into the corner of the letter felt heavier than any apology ever could. I placed the envelope in the drawer beneath the toaster, right next to the spare checkbook I rarely used. Then I poured my coffee and sat by the front window. No curtains drawn. I didn't need to hide anymore. By mid-Thursday, Susan called. Her cousin, the estate advisor, had taken a look at the documents I sent. She wanted to schedule a visit, just to walk me through the next steps. Not urgent, she said. Just smart. I agreed. The following morning, I opened the mailbox and found a thin flyer tucked among the bills. It was glossy. New Beginnings for Seniors. It read, Luxury Adult Condos, Assisted Living Optional, Fully Maintained, Move-in Ready. I didn't remember requesting it, but someone clearly had me in mind. I placed the flyer on the counter, right next to a grocery list I'd scribbled the day before bread, eggs, laundry soap. Then the phone rang. This time, it was Rebecca. Her voice was bright at first, overly sweet. She asked how I was doing, said she heard from Michael that things felt a little tense. She laughed a little after that, a quick kind of laugh, not the warm kind. Then she got to the point, said they were confused, said the bank denied a recent transaction, said she thought there was a mistake. I didn't answer right away. I listened to her keep talking. Her words moved faster, trying to wrap control around a situation that had started slipping. She said the cruise wasn't what it looked like, said it had been booked by her mother, not her, said Michael hadn't even realized how the payment worked, said I might be reading into things. I waited for the part where she asked how I was. It never came. I told her I had already spoken to legal, that everything going forward would be reviewed formally, that any further charges would be flagged, that my estate decisions were being restructured. She went quiet, just for a second. Then came a new tone. She called it overreaction. She mentioned family trust. She said they'd always been there. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I told her I had errands to run. Before I hung up, I could hear her trying to form another sentence, but I didn't stay to hear how it would end. I set the phone down. I picked up the flyer again, read it through, looked at the images of neat hallways, quiet balconies, morning light falling on tidy floors. I didn't make a decision then, but I did fold the flyer carefully and slide it into the side pocket of my purse. Not because I was ready to go, but because for the first time in years, I knew I had options, and none of them had to include being left behind. It was a Monday when the letter came. This time, it wasn't from the bank or the lawyer. It was from Michael, not handwritten, printed, folded with edges too clean, signed with just his name. No warmth. He didn't apologize. Not really. He used words like misunderstood and said the decisions I'd made felt drastic. Said he wished we could sit down and talk through things like we used to. I placed the letter on the same table where last year's Thanksgiving plates had once waited, untouched. Then I poured myself some tea. No sugar, just hot and plain. Later that afternoon, I went out to water the small potted plants on the porch, the ones I nearly forgot about after the holiday. A chill had crept in, but they were still standing, still holding on. I hadn't told anyone yet, but I had listed the house, quietly, through a private agent Susan recommended. No signs, no noise, just a slow, silent shift. The real estate lady came by the following day. Kind eyes, soft voice. She walked through the rooms with care, asked nothing that made me flinch, said the market was steady, said this place had charm. I let her do the talking. She said most buyers these days looked for open kitchens, finished basements, updated roofs. I said mine had history. She smiled, said sometimes that was worth more. That evening, I saw a message flash across my phone from Michael again, a short one. Said he'd heard I was making moves, that the house was part of the family, that it should stay in it. I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because what needed saying was already written into the silence he had left me in months ago. I spent the next morning packing a few boxes. Not the big things, just the ones that mattered. Letters, photos, William's old wristwatch, a recipe card written in my mother's hand. No crystal, no china, just memory wrapped in paper. Then I took out the guest towels, fresh ones, folded and stored high in the linen closet. I laid them out in the hallway bathroom. The smell of lavender rose through the house like a small act of reclaiming space. By Friday, I received word. A family had placed an offer, full price, cash ready. They loved the porch, the light, the old maple outback. I accepted, not with celebration, not with hesitation, either. Just stillness. That night, I sat at the dining table one last time. No candles, no settings. Just me in the house and the echo of every version of myself that once waited here. I didn't feel grief. I felt clarity, because the table they once walked away from would no longer be waiting, and there would be no seat left to return to. The final week before the move passed without warning. No grand emotions, no last-minute visits, just soft steps between packed boxes and the sound of drawers closing for the last time. The morning the agent came with the documents, I had already cleaned everything twice over. The house felt lighter, not empty, just unburdened. She placed the papers on the kitchen counter, the same counter where Michael used to sit with a bowl of cereal before school, where I had once iced cupcakes for birthdays, where I'd left casseroles to cool while waiting on family that never came. I signed slowly, each stroke steady. My hand didn't shake. She thanked me, said the buyers would come by later to walk through once more before the weekend. I nodded. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap. The maple tree had dropped the last of its leaves, bare limbs stretched into a pale sky. The air held a quiet that didn't ache like it once did. Then the car pulled into the driveway. Not the buyers. Michael. He stepped out alone, no warning, no call ahead. He stood at the bottom step like he expected permission, like he still thought this porch belonged to him. I didn't invite him up. I heard about the sale, he said. I thought it was too soon. I was worried you were being impulsive. I said the decision was already made. He looked past me, eyes scanning the boxes near the window. Then the sold sign tucked behind the porch rail. His shoulders dropped slightly. "Where are you going?" he asked. I told him I didn't owe him that answer anymore. "The house holds memories," he said. I said it also held silence, and I had lived with too much of that already. For a moment, I thought he might say something real, something small and true. But instead, he mentioned family again. He said we were still that, no matter what. I stood up. I told him family shows up. Family sits at the table. Family doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. He had nothing left after that. He turned back toward the car. Slower this time. No words, no wave, just the sound of gravel again under tires as he pulled away. Inside, I walked through the rooms one last time. My feet knew every board, every creak. I touched the frame of the front door as I passed, the place where William had once measured Michael's height in pencil marks. Then I walked back into the kitchen. There on the counter, next to the signed forms, was a small envelope I hadn't seen before. Tucked beneath it, a note from the buyers. "Thank you," it said, "for the warmth of this space, for keeping it well." I read it once, then again, and I smiled, because the door Michael thought would always open for him had just welcomed someone else, someone who knew what it meant to say thank you. The last box fit easily in the trunk, just linens, nothing sentimental. The things that had weight had already been moved, sealed gently in softer wrapping than the years had given me. I locked the front door for the final time. No ceremony, no farewell. The house stood behind me like a closed book, not forgotten, just finished. I dropped the keys in the mailbox slot like the agent asked. They clinked once, then disappeared inside. The sun was low, not quite evening. A soft light spilled across the yard. That old maple, now bare, cast long shadows over the walkway. I didn't look back. My car started without hesitation. The drive out of town was quiet, familiar roads, but they didn't grip me anymore. Not like they used to. I passed the gas station where Michael once pumped air into my tires. I passed the grocery store where Rebecca had waved once, too brightly, when she still pretended. None of it stopped me. At a red light near the highway, I saw a cafe I used to love. I almost turned in, but I kept going. That chapter had already closed itself long before I signed anything. By the time I reached the small rental cottage, the sun had set. It wasn't big, just one level, white trim, a porch swing that creaked softly in the wind. The porch light had already been set to turn on at dusk, warm yellow spilling across the welcome mat. I opened the front door with a key that was mine alone. Inside, the space smelled like fresh paint and clean floors. Not home, not yet, but peaceful, honest. I set the linens down on the couch, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain back. No framed photos stared at me. No ghost of an empty chair. I sat down and exhaled. The next morning, I made coffee in a new pot. Simple, no bells, just heat and strength. There were no voicemails, no knocks, just birds in the distance and a quiet that felt earned. And in that silence, I finally understood. I had not walked away. I had simply stopped waiting for someone to remember I was there. They could knock again someday. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But there would be no porch light left on, no table already set, no place that stayed open just in case. Because I hadn't disappeared. I had arrived somewhere I chose, on my own terms, in my own time. A week passed, then another. The days began to stretch longer, not in heaviness, but in stillness. I started each morning with a cup of coffee and the newspaper folded just right. The front porch of my cottage caught enough light to warm my hands while I sat in quiet. No one showed up, no surprise visitors, no calls filled with excuses or rewrites of the past, and I didn't need them to. I started tending the small garden behind the cottage. The soil was firm but forgiving. A patch of rosemary, some thyme, a line of yellow daffodil bulbs waiting under the surface. Simple things, honest things. Sometimes I walked by the lake nearby. The path circled gently, lined with benches. On one of those benches, I met a woman named Gloria, around my age, moved here after her husband passed. We didn't speak much at first, but silence sat comfortably between us. We shared stories over time, not about pain, not about what was lost, but about what we learned to hold. I didn't bring up Michael, not once, not out of bitterness, but because the story was no longer his to shape. The cottage began to feel lived in, a throw blanket draped across the armchair, a lamp I found at the local market casting soft amber across the walls, my old books stacked neatly, breathing again. And on the kitchen counter, a new recipe card sat by itself, handwritten. A peach cobbler I planned to try next Sunday. It wasn't meant for anyone else. Just for me. One evening, I lit a candle on the table. No holiday. No occasion. Just a small gesture to say this moment mattered, that this chapter belonged to me, not out of defiance, but out of choice. Because after all the noise, the waiting, the ache of being forgotten, I had not broken. I had not faded. I had risen, quietly, gracefully, and without needing to be seen. It was a Tuesday morning in late January when I walked into First Vermont Bank to meet with Mr. Peterson, the financial advisor Susan's cousin had recommended. The bank lobby smelled of lemon polish and fresh coffee. A clock ticked steadily above the teller window, its pendulum swinging in even strokes, marking time without judgment. Mr. Peterson looked younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with kind eyes and a steady handshake. He led me to a private office in the back, a space with soft green walls and framed landscapes of Vermont mountains. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, closing the door behind us, "I've reviewed the documents you sent over. First, I want to say I'm sorry about the situation with your accounts." I nodded, grateful he didn't use words like family trouble or misunderstanding. "The good news," he continued, spreading papers on his desk, "is that we've successfully secured your assets. The co-ownership revocation is complete. The secondary account has been closed, and we've transferred those funds to your new, secure account." "And the house sale?" I asked. "The proceeds are here." He pointed to a figure on the statement that still made my breath catch: $475,000. The number seemed unreal, floating on the page like it belonged to someone else's life. "That's quite a substantial amount," he said. "We should discuss how to protect it and make it work for you." I nodded, folding my hands in my lap to steady them. "There's something else," I said. "My granddaughter, Sophie. She's 19, starting college in the fall." Mr. Peterson tilted his head, waiting. "I'd like to set aside money for her education, but in a way her parents can't access." He nodded slowly, not a hint of judgment crossing his face. "We can establish an educational trust. You'd be the trustee until she's of age to manage it herself. The funds would be restricted to educational expenses only." "How much would you recommend?" He did some quick calculations. 100,000 would cover 4 years at a good state university, with some left over for graduate studies if she chooses that path. I pictured Sophie's face, the only one in those cruise photos who occasionally looked at the camera with something like uncertainty, the only one who sometimes seemed to be searching for something just beyond the frame. "Let's do 150, I said, "and I want to include a letter explaining where it came from, that it's between her and me." Mr. Peterson made notes, his pen scratching quietly against the paper. "And the rest," he asked. "I need enough for rent and living expenses. A safety net. Of course, we can set up a monthly distribution from a conservative investment account. That should provide steady income without touching the principal much." We spent the next hour going through options, signing papers, and creating a financial structure I should have built years ago, one that stood on its own, without gaps for anyone else to slip through. When we finished, Mr. Peterson walked me to the door. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "if you don't mind my saying so, you're doing the right thing. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary." I smiled, feeling something like pride warm my chest. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I'm beginning to understand that." As I walked out of the bank, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long, clean shadows across the parking lot. For the first time in months, the chill in the air felt bracing rather than bitter. I took a deep breath, keys firm in my hand, and walked to my car with steady steps. February arrived with a snowstorm that blanketed Lake Champlain in pristine white. From my cottage window, the lake looked like a vast, empty page waiting to be written on. I watched the snow fall for hours, mesmerized by how it transformed familiar shapes into something new and clean. The cottage felt warm and secure, the heater humming steadily, keeping the cold at bay. I had filled the space with small comforts, a quilt from the local artisan shop draped over the sofa, a bookshelf now full of novels I'd been meaning to read for years, a bird feeder outside the kitchen window that attracted cardinals and chickadees. Gloria had become a regular visitor, bringing homemade bread or jars of preserves. "Just extras," she'd say, though we both knew they were made specifically to be shared. We'd sit by the window, watching the birds flit between the feeder and the pine trees, sharing stories of our lives before. She never pushed when I glossed over certain parts, never dug for the pain I wasn't ready to name. Instead, she'd nod and offer her own stories about her late husband's model train obsession that took over their basement, about her daughter in California who called every Sunday like clockwork, about the garden club she wanted me to join when spring arrived. They're good people, she said one afternoon as we watched the snow fall. No drama, just folks who like to get their hands dirty and make things grow. I promised I'd think about it. And I meant it. The days took on a gentle rhythm. Mornings with coffee and the newspaper. Afternoons spent reading or walking when the weather permitted. Evenings cooking simple meals that filled the cottage with comforting scents. I was folding laundry one Thursday when the phone rang. The cottage came with a landline, old-fashioned but reliable. I rarely used it, which made the sharp ring seem louder somehow. I answered with a cautious, "Hello, Mrs. Wilson." A young woman's voice, hesitant. "It's Sophie." I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, the half-folded towel still in my lap. "Sophie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is a surprise." "I know." She paused. "I got your address from Dad's desk. I hope that's okay." "Of course it is." I waited, giving her space to find her words. "I wanted to check if you're all right," she said finally. "After everything." The simplicity of the question caught me off guard. Was I all right? No one had asked that. Not Michael, not Rebecca, just this 19-year-old who somehow found the courage her parents lacked. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. "I have a nice place now, near the lake." "That sounds pretty—" Another pause. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. About Thanksgiving. About the cruise." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling something loosen in my chest. "Did you know," I asked, "that I was expecting you all for dinner?" "Not until later," she said, her voice smaller now. "Mom said you changed your plans too, that you were going to a friend's house. I didn't find out until we were already on the ship, and I asked why we weren't calling you on Thanksgiving Day." The admission hung between us, another piece of the puzzle slotting into place. "I see," I said. "I should have called you myself. I believed them. I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize, Sophie. You're not responsible for your parents' choices." "Dad's really upset about the house," she blurted. "He keeps talking about family legacy and inheritance and stuff. Mom says you overreacted." I took a deep breath. "And what do you think?" "Sophie." She was quiet for so long I thought we might have lost the connection. "I think," she said finally, "that nobody asked what you wanted. And maybe that's been happening for a long time." The wisdom in her words nearly undid me. I pressed my free hand against my heart, feeling it beat strong and steady under my palm. "Would it be okay if I visited sometime?" she asked. "Just me, to see your new place." "I'd like that very much," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, watching the snow continue to fall outside. Sophie's call had opened something in me, not the door back to the past, but perhaps a small window into a different kind of future. I finished folding the laundry, my movements more deliberate now, more present. Then I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to write a letter, the one that would accompany Sophie's trust fund documents. I wanted to get the words just right. March brought the first hints of thaw. Icicles dripped from the eaves of the cottage, creating crystalline music throughout the day. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of earth that had been sleeping beneath. I found myself watching for green, for the first brave shoots that would signal renewal. I'd settled into a comfortable routine at the cottage, twice a week. I volunteered at the local library, shelving books and helping with the children's reading hour. The librarian, a gentle woman named Irene, had become another friendly face in my new world. "You have a knack for this," she told me one afternoon as I finished reading Where the Wild Things Are to a circle of enthralled 5-year-olds. "The children respond to you?" "I taught elementary school for 20 years before Sophie was born," I admitted. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it. "We could always use a regular for story time," she said. Not quite a question, but an open door if I wanted to walk through it. I found myself nodding. "I'd like that." Gloria had made good on her promise to introduce me to the garden club. We met in the community center every other Friday, planning spring planting and sharing cuttings. They welcomed me without prying, a group of women who understood that new beginnings sometimes came from endings you didn't choose. I was pruning the rosemary plant on my kitchen windowsill when I heard a car pull up outside. The cottage was set back from the road, so visitors were rare and usually announced. I peered through the curtain and felt my breath catch. A small blue Toyota I didn't recognize. And stepping out of it, Sophie. She looked older somehow, though it had only been 4 months since I'd last seen her. Her hair was shorter, falling just below her chin instead of past her shoulders. She wore jeans and a green sweater, a backpack slung over one shoulder. I opened the door before she could knock. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the threshold. Then she smiled, tentative but real. "Hi, Grandma." "Sophie," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You found me." You gave good directions. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Is this still a good time? It's perfect, I said, stepping back to let her in. Come see my new place. She followed me inside, her eyes taking in everything, the simple furniture, the books, the quilt, the view of the lake through the back window. It's nice, she said. Cozy. It suits you. Thank you. Would you like some tea or hot chocolate? I remember you always preferred chocolate. Hot chocolate would be amazing. She set her backpack down and followed me to the kitchen. Dad doesn't know I'm here, she added, watching me fill the kettle. I nodded, unsurprised. I figured as much. They're still weird about everything. Mom acts like you disappeared into thin air for no reason. Dad gets quiet whenever anyone mentions you. I set 2 mugs on the counter, choosing my words carefully. People often rewrite the past to make themselves more comfortable with their choices. Sophie leaned against the counter, her eyes more serious than a 19-year-old should be. I got your letter, she said. In the trust fund paperwork. The kettle whistled. I poured the hot water into the mugs, stirred in the chocolate powder, added a small marshmallow to each, a detail I remembered she loved. I wasn't sure if they'd give it to you, I said, handing her a mug. It came directly to my dorm. Dad would have intercepted it if it had gone to the house. She wrapped her hands around the mug. Thank you. For the trust. For the letter. For explaining. You deserve to know. I don't understand why they did it. Any of it. She looked down at her chocolate. The cruise was nice, but it wasn't worth everything else. Sometimes people convince themselves they deserve things they haven't earned, I said. They tell themselves stories to justify taking what isn't freely given. Is that what happened with Dad and the house? The accounts? I nodded. I think somewhere along the way, your father started seeing my things as already his, just waiting for the right moment to claim them. Sophie took a sip of her chocolate, thinking. What about me? She asked finally. Do you see me that way too, as just his? The question broke my heart a little. I reached across the counter and touched her hand. No, Sophie. Never. You're your own person. Always have been. Relief softened her features. Good, because I want to keep visiting. If that's okay? More than okay, I said. This door's always open to you. We took our hot chocolates to the small living room and sat on the couch. Sophie told me about her college classes, her roommate from Seattle, her thoughts about switching her major from business to education. I think I might want to teach, she said. Elementary school, like you did? I felt a swell of something warm and unexpected, not quite pride that seemed too possessive, more like recognition, seeing a piece of myself reflected back in a way I never anticipated. You'd be wonderful at it, I said, later. As the afternoon light began to fade, Sophie helped me prepare a simple dinner of soup and fresh bread. We ate at the small table by the window, watching as the last of the day's light painted the lake in gold and purple. This is nice, she said. Quiet, but nice. Sometimes quiet is what we need to hear ourselves think. She nodded, understanding in a way that seemed beyond her years. After dinner, she reluctantly checked her watch. I should get going. I have an early class tomorrow. Of course. I walked her to the door, where she surprised me by turning and wrapping her arms around me in a tight hug. I missed you, she whispered against my shoulder. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid reality of her in my arms. I missed you too. I'll come back soon, she promised as she pulled away. Maybe for spring break if that's not imposing. This is your place too, Sophie, whenever you need it. I watched from the doorway as she got into her car, waved once, and drove away. The space she left behind didn't feel empty, though. It felt like a room with the windows open, fresh air circulating, making everything feel new. That night, I added another note to the small journal I'd been keeping since moving to the cottage. Just a few lines. Sophie came today. We talked, really talked. She has her father's eyes but her own heart. Some bridges don't burn after all. Some just need to be rebuilt differently. April arrived with daffodils. They pushed through the softening earth in my small garden. Their bright faces turned toward the strengthening sun. I spent more time outside now, cleaning away winter's debris, preparing the soil for new growth. Gloria often joined me, bringing seedlings from her own garden, pansies, snapdragons, herbs that would fill my kitchen with fresh scents all summer. You've settled in nicely, she observed one morning as we worked side by side. You seem lighter. I looked up, brushing soil from my gloves. Do I? She nodded. When you first moved in, you had this, I don't know, this heaviness about you, like you were carrying something invisible. She patted down soil around a small lavender plant. It's not so noticeable now. I considered her words. rolling them over like smooth stones in my palm. I suppose I am lighter. I've set down some things I was never meant to carry. She smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with understanding. That's the trick of it, isn't it? Figuring out what's yours to hold and what isn't? We worked in companionable silence after that, the rhythm of gardening creating its own quiet conversation. Later that week, I received a letter from Mr. Peterson at the bank. Sophie's educational trust was fully established. All the paperwork was in order. The funds were secure and growing modestly with conservative investments. I traced my finger over the account summary, the numbers representing not just money but possibility, freedom, choice, all the things I wanted for her. Sophie had visited twice more since that first afternoon. Each time, she stayed a little longer. We fell into easy patterns cooking together, walking by the lake, talking about books and ideas and her future plans. She never mentioned her parents, and I never asked. It was as if we were creating a separate space, a bubble where only our connection mattered. Until the day she arrived with shadows under her eyes and tension in her shoulders. "What is it?" I asked as soon as she walked in. "What's happened?" She dropped her backpack by the door and sank onto the couch. "Dad found out about the trust fund, about my visits here." I sat beside her, my heart picking up speed. "How, the bank sent some tax form to my dorm. I left it out, and my roommate mentioned it when he called to check in." She rubbed her forehead. "He went ballistic. Said you were trying to buy my loyalty, that you were manipulating me against them." "Oh, Sophie," I sighed. "I'm sorry. That was never my intention." "I know that." She looked at me directly. I told him that. I said the trust was about my education, not about taking sides, but he wouldn't listen. She twisted her fingers together. Then Mom got on the phone and said I was being naive, that I didn't understand what was really going on. "And what did you say to that?" A small, defiant smile touched her lips. I said maybe I understood more than they thought. I felt a surge of pride, quickly tempered with concern. "I never wanted to put you in the middle, Sophie." "You didn't. They did." She leaned back against the cushions. "First, with the cruise and the lies about Thanksgiving, then with all the stuff about the bank accounts and the house. They just assumed I'd accept their version of everything." I nodded, remembering how easily Michael had always revised reality to suit his needs, even as a child. The time he broke my favorite vase and blamed the wind. The dent in the car he attributed to a parking lot stranger. "Your father has always been skilled at creating his own truth," I said carefully. "He wants me to stop visiting you." She looked down at her hands. "Said if I'm going to choose sides, I should know that you've already written them off, that you sold their inheritance without a second thought." The familiar twist of pain surprised me. I thought I'd moved beyond it, but hearing Michael's distortion laid bare brought it all back. "It was never their inheritance," I said quietly. "It was my home, a home they chose to leave empty on Thanksgiving." "I know." She reached for my hand. I told him that too. We sat in silence for a moment, her hand warm in mine. Outside, a spring rain had started, gentle drops tapping against the windows. "What happens now?" I asked. Sophie straightened her shoulders. "Nothing changes. I'm an adult. I decide who I spend time with. If Dad wants to make that into some kind of loyalty test, that's his problem." "It won't be easy," I warned. "Your parents have a strong hold on you. That's natural." "Maybe, but I have the advantage of seeing both sides." She squeezed my hand. "And I choose to see the truth." Later, after Sophie had gone, I stood at the window watching the rain wash over my newly planted garden. Droplets clung to the daffodil petals, making them bow slightly under the weight. I thought about the tenacity of those flowers, pushing through cold earth toward light, about how growth was never a straight line, but a series of bends and reaches, setbacks and surges. Sophie was finding her way, navigating the complicated landscape of family with more grace than I could have hoped for. And somehow, against all odds, we were finding each other anew in the process. I picked up my journal and added another entry. "The rain came today. So did Sophie. Both were necessary. Both will help things grow." May brought warmth and renewal. The garden club organized a plant exchange in the town square, where I met more neighbors and came home with seedlings for tomatoes, peppers, and a climbing rose that would eventually frame my front door. The library's children's program expanded to include twice-weekly story hours, which I now led regularly. The children's delight in stories reminded me of why I'd loved teaching the wonder in their eyes, the questions that showed their minds working, the laughter that came so easily. Sophie called every Sunday evening, a ritual she established after the confrontation with her parents. Sometimes our conversations were light campus gossip. a professor she admired, a book she thought I'd enjoy. Other times, heavier subjects emerged. Dad keeps bringing up the house, she told me one Sunday. He took me for a drive past it last weekend. The new owners have painted the shutters blue. That sounds nice, I said, picturing the change. Blue suits that house. He just stared at it for the longest time. Then he said, "That should have been yours someday. That should have stayed in the family." I sighed, closing my eyes briefly. "And what did you say?" I asked him if he remembered Thanksgiving, if he remembered choosing the cruise over dinner with you. She paused. He changed the subject. Of course he did. I don't understand why he can't just admit what happened, why he can't say he's sorry. Some people, I said carefully, find it impossible to see themselves as the cause of pain. It threatens how they need to see themselves. Well, it's exhausting, Sophie said with sudden heat. The whole thing, the way they rewrite history, the way they expect me to play along. I know, sweetheart, I know. After we hung up, I sat on the porch swing, watching twilight settle over the lake. A pair of mallards skimmed across the water, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. The air smelled of lilacs from the bush at the corner of the yard, sweet and heady. I thought about Michael, sitting in his car, staring at the house that was no longer his to claim. About the story he was telling himself, casting me as the villain who stole his birthright rather than the mother he'd betrayed. The sadness came, as it sometimes still did, not the crushing weight of before, but a softer ache, a recognition of what was lost, what might have been. But alongside it came something else, certainty. I had made the right choice, not out of vengeance, but out of self-preservation, out of the need to finally say enough. The mallards reached the far shore and disappeared into the reeds. The first stars appeared above the darkening lake. I rocked gently on the swing, feeling the solid planks beneath me, the secure chains above. This was my place now, this quiet, this peace, this life I was building one day at a time, one choice at a time. No matter what story Michael told himself, I knew my own truth, and finally, that was enough. Summer arrived with a glory that took my breath away. The gardens around my cottage exploded with color-purple coneflowers, bright yellow black-eyed Susans, the climbing rose now sending tendrils along the porch railing, its pink blooms opening like shy faces to the morning sun. Lake Champlain sparkled under the clear blue skies, sailboats dotting its surface on weekends. I'd taken to swimming most mornings, just a gentle wade into the cool water, then a few strokes parallel to the shore. The water held me, buoyant and forgiving, washing away the night's stiffness from my joints. Gloria often joined me, the two of us venturing into the lake at dawn before the day's heat settled in. Afterward, we'd sit on my porch with coffee, our hair drying in the morning breeze. "You know," she said one such morning, "I never thought I'd start swimming at 72. Funny how life surprises you." I nodded, watching a heron glide across the water's surface. A year ago, I wouldn't have recognized this life, wouldn't have imagined it was possible. "Do you miss it, the old house, the way things were?" I considered the question, giving it the weight it deserved. "I miss what I thought I had," I said finally. "The family I believed in, but that was already gone before I left. I just didn't know it yet." Gloria nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. That was her gift, the ability to hear what wasn't said, to hold space for the complicated truths we all carry. "Sophie's coming for a week," I told her, changing the subject. "Her summer break starts tomorrow." "That's wonderful. Will you bring her to the community picnic on Saturday?" "If she'd like to go," I smiled, anticipation warming me more than the morning sun. She mentioned wanting to help with story time at the library, too. Following in Grandma's footsteps. Perhaps, though I want her to find her own path. Gloria's eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. The best legacy isn't a house or a bank account. It's who we become in each other's lives. I let her words settle around me, feeling their truth in my bones. Sophie arrived the next day, her small car packed with more than just a week's worth of belongings. She unloaded duffel bags, a box of books, her laptop, even a small potted plant, a peace lily that looked slightly wilted from the journey. "I thought you were staying a week," I said, helping her carry things inside. She bit her lip, a gesture I recognized from her childhood when she was nervous about something. "Actually, I was hoping I could stay for the whole summer, if that's not imposing too much." I set down the box I was carrying. "The whole summer. I got a job at the bookstore in town. Mrs. Abernathy hired me last week when I called to ask about summer positions." The words came in a rush. "It's just 3 days a week, so I'd still have plenty of time to spend with you. And I can help with the garden, and maybe the story time you mentioned. And, Sophie, I interrupted gently, slow down. Of course you can stay. I'd love nothing more. I'm just surprised. She exhaled, relief softening her features. I was going to stay with Mom and Dad, but after everything, I just need some space, some quiet, to figure things out. I nodded, understanding completely. This is your home, too, for as long as you need it. Her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Thank you. We spent the afternoon settling her into the small second bedroom that had been serving as my reading nook. I cleared out the extra books, made up the twin bed with fresh linens, and found a small desk at the thrift store in town that would fit perfectly under the window. It's not very big, I apologized as we arranged her things. It's perfect, she said, placing her peace lily on the windowsill. Just what I need. That evening, we cooked dinner together, a simple pasta with vegetables from my garden. As we ate on the porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and gold, Sophie grew quiet. What is it? I asked, noticing the furrow between her brows. She set down her fork. Dad called while I was unpacking. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail. She pulled out her phone and played it for me. Michael's voice filled the space between us, tight with controlled anger. Sophie, your mother and I just found out about your so-called summer plans. I don't know what Grandma has told you or promised you, but this has gone far enough. Call me back. We need to talk about this. I felt my shoulders tense. Even now, months later, his voice could transport me back to that Thanksgiving silence, that moment of realization that I had been erased from the table. He called twice more after that, Sophie said, putting the phone away. I texted that I was safe and would call tomorrow. I just couldn't face it tonight. You don't have to explain, I said. You're an adult. You get to make your own choices. They don't see it that way, especially not when it involves you. She looked out over the lake, her profile etched against the darkening sky. Dad's convinced you've poisoned me against them, that you're using me to get back at him for whatever grievances you're holding on to. The accusation stung, even secondhand. Is that what you think? She turned to me, her eyes clear and direct. No. If anything, you've been careful not to put me in the middle. You've never asked me to choose sides. Because there shouldn't be sides. Sophie, this isn't a war. It's just life. Complicated, messy life. She nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. I'll call him tomorrow. Set some boundaries. Make it clear this is my decision. Would you like me to talk to him? No, she said quickly. That would just confirm his suspicions. I need to handle this myself. I recognized the determination in her voice, the same tone I'd used when I signed the paper selling the house, the sound of someone reclaiming their own agency. All right, I said. But I'm here if you need me. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the shore. The moon cast a silver path across the water, a road leading somewhere beyond sight. I thought about Michael's accusation. Was I using Sophie to punish him? Had some unconscious part of me encouraged her presence as a way to twist the knife I searched my heart honestly, turning over every conversation, every interaction with my granddaughter, and what I found wasn't vengeance or manipulation, but simply love, the desire to know this remarkable young woman who was finding her own way in the world, the joy of rediscovering family on new terms. If Michael couldn't see that, it said more about his perspective than mine. I added a new entry to my journal before going to bed. Sophie has come to stay for the summer. Michael sees a plot. I see healing. Perhaps we're both right in our own way. The same action can be both a closing and an opening, depending on which side of the door you stand. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Sophie quickly settled into her job at the bookstore, coming home with stories about customers and recommendations for books we should read together. 3 mornings a week, she joined me at the library for story time, her animated readings captivating the children even more than mine did. She had a gift for voices, each character distinct, each moment brought to life with just the right inflection. You're a natural, I told her after one particularly successful session. The children adore you. She blushed, pleased with the praise. I think I want to focus on early childhood education when I go back to school. Maybe specialize in literacy. You'd be wonderful at it. Our days fell into pleasant patterns. Morning swims in the lake, breakfast on the porch, work me in the garden or at the library, Sophie at the bookstore. Evenings cooking together, reading, talking about everything and nothing. The only disruption came in the form of phone calls from Michael and Rebecca. At first, they called Sophie daily, their messages growing increasingly frustrated when she maintained her boundaries. They want me to come home for the 4th of July weekend, she told me one evening in late June. Dad says it's non negotiable since it's always been a family tradition. I remembered those 4th of July barbecues in the backyard of the old house, the sparklers Michael would light for Sophie, the homemade ice cream Rebecca would bring, the way we'd all sit on the porch as darkness fell, waiting for the town fireworks to begin. Perhaps you should go, I said carefully. Traditions matter. Sophie looked surprised. You wouldn't mind? Of course not. They're your parents. Sophie, whatever happened between us doesn't change that. She considered this, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. Would you come too if they invited you? The question caught me off guard. I don't think that invitation is forthcoming, sweetheart. But if it was, would you come? I thought about it honestly, about sitting across from Michael at the picnic table, about making small talk with Rebecca, about pretending the cruise never happened. The accounts were never emptied, the house never sold. I don't know, I admitted. Some bridges are harder to rebuild than others. Sophie nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'll go, but just for the day, not the whole weekend. The morning she left for her parents' house, I helped her pack a small overnight bag just in case she changed her mind about staying. You have the spare key? I asked as she headed for her car. Right here. She patted her pocket. And I'll text when I arrive, and before I head back tomorrow. Drive safely. She hugged me tight before getting into her car. Thank you, she whispered. For understanding. I watched her drive away, feeling a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. Pride in her maturity, worry about the reception she'd receive, a small, selfish sadness at the quiet she left behind. Gloria stopped by that afternoon with a basket of fresh cherries from her tree. We sat on the porch, pitting them for a pie, our fingers stained purple red. So the girl's gone to see her parents, she said, not a question. Just for the day, for their 4th of July celebration. Gloria nodded, dropping another pitted cherry into the bowl. That's good. Healing doesn't mean erasing the past, it means finding a way to carry it differently. I smiled at her practical wisdom. When did you get so philosophical? Around the same time my knees started creaking, she laughed. Getting old means either getting bitter or getting wise. I chose the latter. I'm trying to do the same, I said. You're succeeding. She popped a cherry into her mouth. More than you know. The day stretched long without Sophie's presence. I weeded the garden, made a solitary lunch, read on the porch as afternoon turned to evening. The first distant pops of fireworks started around 8, bright blooms of color over the far side of the lake. I was about to go inside when I heard a car on the gravel drive. Sophie wasn't due back until tomorrow. I stood, peering into the twilight, my heart quickening with unnamed worry. The car that pulled up wasn't Sophie's blue Toyota. It was a black SUV I didn't recognize, and stepping out of the driver's side was Michael. He stood by the car for a moment, looking at the cottage, at me on the porch. Even in the fading light, I could see the tension in his posture, the stiffness in his shoulders. Michael, I said, breaking the silence. This is a surprise. He approached the steps, but didn't climb them. Mother, the formality in his tone made something in me ache. This tall man with graying temples had once been the boy who ran to me with skinned knees and treasures found in the garden, who had cried in my arms when his father died, who had danced with me at his wedding. Is everything all right? I asked. Is Sophie? She's fine. She's with Rebecca. He looked past me at the cottage. So this is where you've been hiding. I haven't been hiding, Michael. I've been living. His gaze returned to me, sharp with something I couldn't quite identify. May I come in, or would you prefer to have this conversation on the porch? That depends on what the conversation is. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my throat tighten. I'm not here to fight. Mom, I'm here because it's the 4th of July, and you weren't there. The simplicity of the statement caught me off guard. I wasn't invited, I said quietly. Would you have come if you were? The echo of Sophie's question from days earlier wasn't lost on me. I don't know. Would I have been welcome? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, Sophie refused to stay for the fireworks. Said she couldn't celebrate properly when part of the family was missing. I'm sorry. I didn't ask her to do that. I know. He looked down at his feet, then back up at me. May I come up? Please. I hesitated, then nodded, stepping back to make room on the porch. He climbed the steps slowly, as if unsure of his welcome. Up close, I could see the lines around his eyes had deepened. There was a weariness to him I hadn't noticed before. Would you like some iced tea? I offered, falling back on the hospitality that had been bred into my bones. Thank you. I went inside to pour 2 glasses. aware of him following me, his eyes taking in the cottage, the simple furniture, the books, the quilts, the view of the lake through the back windows. It's nice, he said as I handed him a glass. Suits you? Thank you. I gestured to the small sofa. Please, sit. We settled across from each other, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Outside, more fireworks bloomed in the distance, momentarily painting the room in flashes of color. Michael took a long drink of his tea, then set the glass down carefully. I've been angry, he said finally, about the house, about the accounts, about Sophie spending the summer here. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. Rebecca says I need to let it go, that what's done is done. He looked down at his hands. But I can't stop thinking about Thanksgiving, about that cruise. My heart beat faster. This was the first time he'd mentioned it directly. Sophie told us what happened, he continued. How you made dinner and waited for us. How we never showed up. Yes, I said simply. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. That you'd understand. That family forgives. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. But that's not what happened, is it? No. You waited, and we didn't come. And then you found out about the cruise. I nodded again. I should have told you, he said, about the trip, about using the account. It was easier not to. And then one lie led to another. And suddenly we were on the ship, and I was pouring that wine you gave me, and I just pushed you out of my mind. The honesty of it stung, but I appreciated it more than any smoothed-over version. Why, I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. Why did it become so easy to erase me? He flinched at the word erase. I don't know, he said after a long pause. Maybe because you've always been so self-sufficient, so capable. I told myself you'd be fine, that you probably had other plans anyway. I didn't. I know that now. He rubbed his face, a gesture of frustration or regret. I couldn't tell. Sophie made that very clear. Describe the table settings, the food, how you sat there alone. I closed my eyes briefly, surprised by how much it still hurt to have that image called up again. I'm not here to make excuses, Michael said. What we did was wrong, on every level. I opened my eyes to find him watching me, his expression more open than I'd seen it in years. The house, he continued. I understand why you sold it. I don't like it, but I understand. It wasn't about punishment, Michael. It was about reclaiming something that was mine, something that had been taken without asking. He nodded slowly. I've been thinking a lot about that, about the accounts, about the joint ownership forms, about how easy it was to convince myself I deserved access to everything you had. The admission hung between us, raw and honest. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm sorry for Thanksgiving, for the cruise, for the accounts, for all of it. The words I'd wanted to hear for months. The acknowledgement I'd given up hoping for, and yet, they didn't magically erase the pain or instantly rebuild what had been broken. Thank you for saying that, I said carefully. It means a lot to hear it. But it doesn't fix everything. No, it doesn't, he nodded, accepting this truth. Sophie loves it here, loves being with you. I love having her. She's remarkable. Michael, you and Rebecca have raised an extraordinary young woman. A small smile touched his lips. We did something right, at least. Many things right. Outside, the fireworks were reaching their finale, bright bursts coming faster now, illuminating the room in staccato flashes of light. Rebecca and I have been talking, Michael said, his voice quieter now. About what happened, about moving forward. I waited, letting him find his way. We'd like to have you over for dinner next week. Nothing fancy, just a meal together. The invitation caught me by surprise. All of us. Yes, you, me, Rebecca, Sophie, of course. He hesitated. If you're willing. I thought about what it would mean. Not a return to how things were that wasn't possible, but perhaps the first tentative step toward something new, something built on clearer boundaries and harder truths. I'd like that, I said. Relief softened his features. Good, that's good. We sat in silence as the last of the fireworks faded, leaving the room in gentle darkness broken only by the table lamp's warm glow. I should go, Michael said finally, standing. Rebecca will be wondering where I am. I walked him to the door. At the threshold, he turned, hesitating. Mom, yes, the cottage really does suit you. You seem at peace here. I smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. I am. I found something here I didn't know I was looking for. He nodded, a look of understanding, perhaps even respect, crossing his face. Good night, Mom. Good night, Michael. I watched from the porch as he drove away, tail lights disappearing down the dark road. The night was quiet now, the celebration over, just the gentle sound of waves on the shore. I didn't feel the dramatic closure I might have once expected. No swelling music, no perfect resolution like the end of a film. Instead, I felt something quieter, a gentle shifting, like furniture being rearranged to make room for something new. Not everything fixed, but perhaps something beginning to heal. I went inside, picked up my journal, and added a new entry. Michael came tonight. We talked about Thanksgiving, about the cruise, about everything. Not all wounds closed, but some air finally reached them. Perhaps that's how healing begins, not with grand gestures, but with small moments of truth, with the courage to sit in the same room with your pain and look it in the eye. The dinner at Michael and Rebecca's house the following week was awkward, but not disastrous. Rebecca was stiffly polite, clearly there under protest. Michael tried too hard, filling silences with forced cheer. Sophie watched us all with cautious hope, but we did it. We sat at the same table. We passed dishes. We acknowledged, through our presence, if not our words, that something had been broken and that we were at least willing to see if it could be mended. As summer stretched on, these dinners became a monthly occurrence, each one a little less strained than the last. We never discussed the cruise directly again, or the house, or the accounts. Some wounds were still too fresh for casual conversation. But we built something new around the edges of the old pain, a careful, mindful connection. Not the unthinking closeness of before, but something more intentional, more honest. Sophie continued to split her time most days at the cottage with me, occasional weekends with her parents, a bridge between worlds that were slowly, tentatively reaching toward each other again. By August, as the summer began its gentle slide toward autumn, I found myself sitting once more on my porch with Gloria, watching the lake turn gold in the evening light. So, she said, her knitting needles clicking steadily, the prodigal son has returned. I smiled at her biblical reference. In a manner of speaking, though in this version, I think we were all a little lost. And now, I consider the question, watching a sailboat make its way across the water, its white sail bright against the darkening sky. Now we're finding our way, differently than before, more carefully. Good, she said with a decisive nod. Family should be chosen, not just inherited, even when it's blood. I think you're right. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds the click of her needles and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. You know, Gloria said eventually, when Henry died, I thought my life was over. 38 years together. And suddenly, he was gone. I couldn't imagine what came next. I nodded, understanding all too well. But then I realized something. She paused her knitting, looking out over the lake. The life I had with him was precious, irreplaceable, but it wasn't the only life I was meant to have. No, no, it was a chapter, an important one, but not the whole book. She smiled at me, the setting sun catching the silver in her hair. Your life with William, your years in that house, being Michael's mother in the way you were, those were chapters too. And this, I gestured to the cottage, the garden, the lake beyond. This is the chapter you're writing now, on your own terms. I let her words settle around me, feeling their truth in my bones. That night, after Gloria had gone home and the cottage was quiet, I stood at the window looking out at the moonlight on the water. A year had passed since that silent Thanksgiving, a year of loss and discovery, of endings and beginnings. I thought about the empty table I had sat at then, the plates untouched, the gravy gone cold, the silence that had seemed to swallow everything. And I thought about my life now, the garden thriving under my care, the children at the library who knew me by name, Gloria's friendship, Sophie's summer of growth and discovery, even the tentative new understanding with Michael. None of it erased what had happened, the betrayal, the hurt, the necessary endings, but standing in my cottage by the lake, watching the moon cast its silver path across the water, I understood something I hadn't before. Sometimes the thing that breaks you open is the very thing that makes room for new light to enter. I picked up my journal one last time and wrote, they left me alone at Thanksgiving. So I sold the house they thought they would inherit. That's how the story began, but it isn't how it ends. The truth is, they left me alone, so I found myself again. They emptied the table, so I built a new one. They closed a door, so I opened another. And through that door came a life I never imagined, smaller in some ways, but wider in all the ways that matter. A life that fits me perfectly because I shaped it with my own hands, not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but out of the simple, revolutionary act of finally putting myself first. They left me alone at Thanksgiving, and in that loneliness, I found my way home. I closed the journal and set it on the bedside table. Outside, the lake continued its gentle conversation with the shore. Inside, the cottage held me in its simple embrace. This was home now, not the one I had planned for, not the one I had spent decades creating, but the one I had found when I finally stopped waiting at a table where I had been forgotten, the one I had built with my own hands, my own heart, my own truth. And it was enough, more than enough. It was mine.